All right, yeah, let's get started. Are you recording? Do you need me to wait a little bit? All right, cool. Hopefully, like, zoom really close in here, and then I'll add like a 500-person audio track afterwards, so it looks like we got tons of people. But thanks for coming. My name is Tim. I really appreciate that you guys have come to spend the last session of the very first NDC Minnesota with me tonight. I don't know about you, I've loved the conference so far. Seen some good stuff. Awesome. So yeah, this is Browser Invasion, desktop apps on the web. This is my obligatory emoji because I feel like every talk here has to have at least one, but this is my only one, I promise. No more emojis after this. So like I said, my name is Tim. I'm on Twitter and most other social areas at Tim G. Thomas, timgthomas.com, all that other good stuff. I work for Vectra AI. We are a cybersecurity company, and we are based out of lovely, sunny Austin, Texas, which is quite a bit warmer right now than it is here. Though when I flew up from Austin here, it was warmer here than it was in Austin by a few degrees. So I think I like brought, that's the most I could do for you guys. Just bring about 5 degrees and that's about it. So today I'd like to talk about apps, right? So we've all got apps all over the place. If your dock looks anything like mine, you have a lot of them. Or if you're a Windows person, your start bar, start menu, any of that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of these things. And it's easy to see why. So for one, we get a fairly decent user experience. Like these apps are very snappy. They've got a lot of responsiveness because they're written using native programming languages and APIs that are fairly close to the metal on your box. So they can be pretty fast. They're also fairly discoverable, meaning now, these days, we've got all kinds of app stores that we can go to and locate things that interest us, right? Search for keywords. There's still a lot of these apps out there, but it's a lot easier to find an app on the App Store than it is to open up a web browser and there's Google and you can, where do you go from there? And then, again, the native APIs are a really big part of this too. So historically, to be more specific, apps have been able to access cameras and accelerometers and direct access to network, power, all kinds of things like that we haven't always had access to on browser apps. So speaking of browser apps, there's also a lot of these things around. There's a ton of browsers, a ton of apps on the internet. We use them all the time. Many of them now actually have native counterparts, either on desktops or on mobile phones, stuff like that, but they are all over the place. So ubiquity is kind of the biggest thing that web apps have going for them. Almost every device that has a screen has access to the internet, even refrigerators these days. You can actually go there and open up a web page right on the front of your refrigerator for whatever reason you would want to do that. And so you have access to the internet and all of the things that are on the internet as a result of that. They're also fairly extensible. If you've seen some of the other talks that we've had here at NDC this week, I mean, one of the first ones, I think, after Dylan's keynote was about running .NET on the browser, like writing native .NET and having it get interpreted into WebAssembly so that it can run in a browser. And so we have the ability to write all kinds of different, using all kinds of different languages, technologies, frameworks, all kinds of things like that for the web. And then finally, and this is the one that everyone kind of talks about, is presumably, at least some of you, are already web developers. You already have the skills to write web applications. Now, I have an asterisk here because I'm not sure I completely agree with this sentiment. It's great, fantastic to join a community or start using a technology because it has skills that you currently have. But my concern is sometimes that does lead to stagnation. You don't try to learn things outside your comfort zone using different technologies. The web is actually especially bad for this. There's kind of been a lot of not amazing things to say about JavaScript this week as well. It's not everyone's favorite language. So there's been attempts to apply some new ways of thinking to how we're writing applications for the web. But nonetheless, if you do have these skills, if you know how to do HTML and CSS and JavaScript, you can absolutely build whatever you want for the web. So we've got these two sort of disparate things. How do we kind of combine them together? And for that I would like to introduce Electron. Was anyone at David's talk yesterday on Electron? So I got a nod. Is there anyone who wasn't there? Like show of hands or something? Okay, good. About half the room actually wasn't there. So this part will be a little review for some of you and not review hopefully for the rest of you. So Electron is an open source project by GitHub, and it combines two main parts. One is Chromium. So it looks like the Chrome logo, kind of is the Chrome logo. Chromium is a product or a open source platform that powers a lot of the Chrome-related things. So Chrome for the desktop, Chrome for mobile, also Electron. And it's a kind of a low-level browser, if you will. So it has some browser APIs, not as many as a full-fledged browser, but many. It also has lower-level API access to more native applications. So it's kind of an abstraction over your default native app on a Windows box or a Linux box or a Mac box, but also gives you some places to plug in more web-ish APIs. The other part of this is Node.js. Anyone unfamiliar with Node.js? At least having heard of it somewhat? Okay, I know it's late. All right, good. So Node is a JavaScript for the server, right? So it's fairly fast, built on a runtime called V8, developed by Google. Pretty fast. Works fairly well in tandem with Chromium. And so both of these things merged together will let you build desktop apps. So we already saw a couple of apps down here. Sorry in the back if you can't see, but this is sort of an example of my doc here. If you're noticing that some of the icons are a little bit different, I apologize. I have a thing with icons, so I actually kind of redo them and make my own. But hopefully everything is at least somewhat familiar. And it actually turns out that those four there are not pure native apps. They are all Electron apps. So to kind of enumerate them, the leftmost one is Atom, which is a GitHub created text editor, similar to Sublime, that kind of thing. Open source, pretty cool stuff there. We'll go into that a little bit later. Next to it is another product called Hyper, which is a command line, shell, bash, zeesh, whatever you prefer, also written in Electron. I'm going to skip over the third one. That's one of my own, and we'll talk about that one a little bit later, time permitting. And then the last one over there is Slack. And I think a lot of people that I've spoken to first encountered the kind of ideal scenario of building apps in Electron with Slack. If any of you have used Slack, you know it's very responsive. It has great user experience, and even if you're not a huge fan of the whole Office chat idea, it's at least a very polished app, and it's written in Electron. So you can actually do some pretty amazing things with it, even though it's not necessarily purely native. So getting into a little more detail about what Electron is, I like to think of it like a very basic browser tab. So most browsers have your tabs up at the top. Usually people have 50 or 60 or 100. And so a basic Electron app is one tab. You can have some multiples, but just to keep things simple, we've got one tab, and then we've got the browser Chrome, the frame around it. Except in an Electron app, the size of the browser could be the full window, or most of it except for the title bar. But ultimately, it is a shell application that you have access to programmatically control, as well as basically a browser tab, which you also have programmatic access to control. Which means both of these things also run JavaScript. And one interesting side effect of this is that, and I think David also mentioned this yesterday, this is basically Chrome because it runs on Chromium, which also means that you're using Chrome or Chromium's rendering engine, which means you don't have to have browser compatibility. If it works in Chrome, more than likely it will work in an Electron application with very few modifications. So this is actually pretty cool. You can use a lot of the more modern JavaScript features, more modern CSS features, web components, all kinds of cool stuff, just because this is essentially one huge Chrome application. Which also means that you can put any kind of framework in it that you might want to run, because it's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So for this example, I'm actually going to use Ember because I find it's one of the easiest to get started with Electron. It's also one of my favorite JavaScript apps for larger, more long-term apps that need a little bit of maintenance over time. So be prepared because we're going to get into some really, really complex command line magic here, all right? You ready for this? There you go. So this is all you need to make an Electron app with Ember. So if you're not familiar with the Ember part of this equation, Ember has a command line tool called Ember CLI. They're fairly creative in many ways, but naming their command line tool is not necessarily one of them. And Ember init will create a new Ember project. Ember install Ember Electron adds an add-on that Ember has a fairly robust plugin ecosystem. Someone wrote an add-on that has everything you need for Electron, and then Ember Electron actually executes the Electron shell. Make sense so far? So this is still conference Wi-Fi, so I'm not going to do this live, but I did this earlier and cut out all of the boring parts, and so we can watch that now. So what's going to happen now, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, all the command line is doing now is creating a couple of files, a few dozen files, that some of which are Ember, some of which are Electron. Now it's installing some dependencies, and this will take just a moment. This works, this version I actually am using Yarn, which is a different package manager from Node's default. Everything here also works with NPM. Now it's shifting over into the Ember build part. And it has finished that. And there you go. Here is an Ember application that's running inside of Electron. And you can see the normal title bar for Mac OS right there. And all I've done here is run these three commands. I just ampersanded them together. This is the exact three commands that I ran. All told, that video was about 2.5 or 3 minutes. I did it at the hotel, so hotel Wi-Fi, not much better than conference Wi-Fi. But that's all it took. And everything ran, and there you go. You have an Electron app. If you decide not to go that direction, you have to do some things manually yourself. There is an Electron command line tool as well. And just by giving it a directory, it's a little bit hard to see in the star field, but there is a period after the Electron. So Electron, current directory, dot, and it will package all of that stuff up and also give you an Electron application. I tend to prefer some of the boilerplates, for example, the Ember Electron project. It just cuts down on the amount of files that you need to manually create, and therefore things you have to remember. So at this point, I'm going to shift over and we'll take a look at an Electron app. Let me see if this is going to keep my screen resolution. I'm worried it might not. I think we're good. Let me make sure that I'm... Nope, let's go 720. There's always a little bit of anxiety when the blue screen is up. It's like, is it actually going to load? All right, cool. So, here we go. So this is the app that was output by those commands. And I've just called it Ember Electron Test. Let's see, can I do this? Yeah. So Ember Electron Test, that's all we got there. Now there's a few files that I'd like to draw your attention to. One is this app folder. Everything in here is Ember specific. So if you don't care about Ember, you can absolutely ignore it. It's a lot of structure, but empty, so that Ember provides you places to put things for your actual Ember application. But the important thing is everything that's in app is just part of the stuff that's in the browser version of your Electron app, not necessarily related to the outside Chrome. Everything in Ember Electron, however, is related to that Chrome. And this is some boilerplate that Electron projects can use. So main.js is your entry point for the Electron application from the Chrome, the outside native-ish perspective. And so you can see some things in here like what happens when all of the windows are closed in this application. Here's a place that you can provide some reasonable defaults for your application. Size, position on the screen, whether it can be turned into a full screen mode, that kind of thing. There are some event handlers for what happens if something bad happens. So if your application failed to load, or if it crashed somehow, if it became unresponsive, if it then became re-responsive again, all kinds of things like that allow you to handle these scenarios that are fairly common for native apps, but we don't usually have to worry about on the web. We don't think about things like, well, what happens if your whole computer becomes unresponsive for the web app? We're just sort of, we let the browser take care of that. Well, this is a way that you can provide a more tailored experience for your users. So if it becomes unresponsive, you can try to clean up some variables that you might not need, throw up a notification saying like, hey, sorry, this is taking a while to process, that kind of thing. Now some of these other folders are, we'll get into these a little bit later, but effectively static files that are related to your Electron install. So things like icons, splash screens, any of that kind of stuff you can put inside here. So at this point, let's go ahead and run this thing. So I'm going to bring up my command line. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to run Ember Electron. And then I'm now running node 10, which is why it's giving me the promises API is experimental. It's okay here, but I wouldn't recommend trying to upgrade your node version on the morning before you're giving a talk, just in case. So this is the same thing we saw before. This part was everything in the video without all of the dependency installation. So it actually came up fairly quickly. Not a huge issue here. So I'm actually going to come in here and look at this application template. Again, this is a little bit of an Ember concern, but for the purposes of this demo, it's a template that determines what gets shown on our Electron application. So here I will just, let's say, hello Minnesota. Hit save, and thanks to the magic of Ember CLI, it auto-refreshes. This isn't an Ember-specific thing. A lot of different frameworks have this feature. But again, this is just sort of, Ember gives it to you by following those 3 commands that we had before. So anytime we make a change here, we get an update inside our Electron app. We can also update styles. So I'm going to come in here. Let's change the color to something a little bit more festive, and refreshes. You might be able to see actually in the middle there, the Ember server is detecting updates to these files and then triggering a refresh. So you actually have a decent developer experience just here with whatever defaults that Electron gives you. But using text editors is very 6 months ago. These days, everyone does everything in DevTools, right? So here's DevTools inside Electron. Since Electron is a browser application, we get access to the normal Chrome DevTools. So here, let me move this over to the side and give us a little more room to work with. I have all of the normal DevTools that I've come to expect from Chrome. I can inspect these elements. I can actually go into the style sheets. I can change this if I want and see it instantly update. I actually have a couple of additional tools that I'd like to draw your attention to. So let me actually make this a little bit easier to read from the chartreuse. So Ember has its own Chrome DevTools called Ember DevTools, probably named by the CLI group. They're pretty awesome. I won't go into detail because this isn't an Ember talk, but Ember has these, React has these, Angular has these. Most modern frameworks have DevTools, but because this is still Chrome, you can still install these things and have them available here. Now, Ember Electron actually does this injection for you. If you tried to run Electron manually, you would have to actually run a command in the little console thing to import the DevTools that you're trying to use and get them to install. So Ember Electron does that for you. Otherwise, it's the normal stuff. So you can look at your network tab, which doesn't do much now because we don't have any network requests. But you can actually refresh this and see that it is still loading some things. We're just not actually getting them from outside our local network. We're getting them from the local browser, if you will, from the Electron runtime itself. The other kind of interesting thing here is a tool called, let me move my cursor, called Devtron. This is something that comes built in with Electron, and it allows you to get some detailed information about your Electron app itself. So we can look at any event listeners that might be attached on the page. We can do some basic accessibility checking. I actually have no idea what this is going to do. Cool. So we're not doing too hot on our accessibility. We don't have the human language. We don't. This one's actually fine. Yeah, we're good here. We don't have any meaningful images on the page, so we're good on that side. But you can do a lot of little tests just based off of this this Devtron plugin. This thing IPC, keep that in your mind. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Otherwise, there's some linting errors if you need, all kinds of cool stuff right here inside of DevTools. Now, when you're releasing your Electron app, let me go back into Atom here, which is my text editor of choice. You have the option of actually leaving this feature on. And so this is a normal build of Atom. I'm actually running the beta, but this works on the normal Atom as well. And just come in here, and for Mac, it's Command-Option-I. Windows is like Control-Shift-I or something. And it's your normal DevTools here as well. So if you haven't done this to your text editor, get a new text editor. But I really, really love this feature. So I can actually come in here and inspect every element inside my text editor as if it was a normal web app, because it is a normal web app just inside of an Electron shell instead of a browser. And a lot of other tools do this as well. So here's my shell. I can open this up here as well. And I can come in here and just inspect the normal elements here too. And as I highlight over the different elements, it highlights them inside the app, just like any other DevTools. So pretty cool stuff there. Okay, let me switch back into presentation mode. There we go. All right, cool. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some architecture. Now, again, we've got our browser frame outside, and then we've got our browser window sort of inside. And again, they're both JavaScript. So one way that actually helps me understand how these things communicate together is to think of them like a normal web page. So in case you're trying to load data from anywhere on the internet, you would do an API request. So jQuery AJAX or Fetch or WebSockets or something along those lines. So you're asynchronously loading something from some other place because you don't know how long it's going to take. And then once it's done, do something else. Fairly standard Web 101 type stuff. Load some collection of widgets from some server elsewhere that you don't care about. It actually helps to do that with Electron too. Except instead of hitting an external server, you're hitting the wrapper Chrome around your application. And you do that through something called IPC. You might remember this from the DevTools a few moments ago. IPC stands for in-process communication. And it's a way for asynchronous requests to go over the boundary between our browser window and our Electron Chrome. So let me show you a little bit of code to hopefully give you an example of that. So if you're not familiar with the require syntax for JavaScript modules, anytime you do require, it's actually bringing in a separate module, and then you can reference some properties of that thing. So we've got two here that we get through the normal Electron package, IPC main and IPC renderer. I always get confused with these because it turns out IPC main, even though my file that runs the Electron shell is called main, is actually the browser part. It's the thing that renders your web page. IPC renderer is the thing that renders your web page. This is why I always get confused. But IPC renderer is kind of the shell around your app, and then IPC main is your JavaScript app itself. With me so far? More or less? Okay. So inside our IPC main, we can say whenever there is a request, then here's a callback for it. So this is fairly similar to any kind of async code that you might have written with promises, that kind of thing, except it does use callbacks. This is to enable that sort of async nature. So we're not going to actually block rendering or anything. We're just going to say whenever we receive a request for, in this case, an event called Ember request, then here's the thing that we're going to execute to send a reply back. So then we say event, which is the, can I actually do this thingy? Nope. That's good. The EVT parameter is the event object that gives us a reference to, in this case, the browser, and we can send it a reply. In this case, we're going to pass yay as our parameter, and the electron reply is the name of the event. So if you're familiar with any kind of jQuery, this is kind of like a dot on with jQuery, except instead of dot on click, you have dot on and your own custom event name. Now the other side of this, inside the browser, if you will, is going to get a reference to the renderer, which again is the Chrome, the electron part, and whenever it gets a reply from that object, then do something. So in this case, we're going to do a console log reply received, log out the reply, and then we're going to send it the Ember request. So this is the, actually make the asynchronous request part, which this handler is going to execute and then send back the reply of yay, and then we get reply received yay written out to the console. So this is one way of doing asynchronous operations between the browser frame and its containing Chrome. And one place that this works out well is something like this. So FS is a file system module for Node. And in this case, what we're doing is reading a directory of files and then sending out the list of those files back to the consuming application. Now, excuse me. It is possible to require FS directly in your client code. So I could go into the Ember side, I could write require FS, I could do readdir from FS, and actually have all of that happen. But there's two main reasons why I tend not to do that. One, because you're doing file system access from your rendering page, it can actually make your app slightly unresponsive, slow it down a bit. There's some concerns about performance in that case. The containing page, the Chrome, is a lot more prepared to handle those types of requests. So I tend to offload those to the Electron shell itself. The other reason is, especially if you're using JavaScript frameworks that are designed to help you reuse code over a bunch of different projects, you don't want to tie yourself to a file system implementation on your client code, because this might be the only place in your application stack where you're referencing the file system and running it inside of an Electron app. Everywhere else, it could be on a PhoneGap app, it could be on a normal web browser, any number of other things. So you don't want to tie yourself to a specific NPM module that's not available in the browser. Make sense? All right, cool. So one of the things that we talked about earlier is that native apps have an enhanced visual experience, user experience, that kind of thing. And what I mean by that is things like a menu bar up at the top that has the name of the application and some menus next to it, presumably that have some custom commands you might want to run. Maybe some notifications in the top right corner. So these are built-in macOS things. You can send messages to your users that way. Maybe you've got a custom icon down at the bottom. Maybe you've got a menu inside of that custom icon. And these are all sorts of things that native apps do quite well, so well that we usually don't even think about them. So Windows users have jump lists. Right-click an icon in your start bar and you can choose an item from there. It's just sort of a natural thing that users tend to pick up over using operating systems. So how can we actually get this sort of thing inside of Electron apps? Turns out we actually have some pretty great APIs to be able to do that. These are a couple that I actually quite like and use fairly frequently. Menu is a great way of creating that application menu at the top. This is one of those things, though, that Linux and macOS has. Windows doesn't necessarily have it in quite the same way, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Notifications, so we saw the notification in the top right of the screen. The touch bar, so I'm running a touch bar Mac. I actually can access this touch bar and do some cool things with it. And then tray is sort of a Windows tray thing that you can access, create icons there, that sort of thing. The APIs for doing that are fairly straightforward as well. So you require Electron. We've already seen this with the IPC render and IPC main. And then you grab, in this case, a menu constructor out of it, give it some details, whatever you want to be in your menu, and then tell Electron that that's what the application menu for the app should be. And actually, that's it. So let me show you a little bit of a demo of how some of these native things work. And they all effectively use the same set of APIs to do this, just in slightly different ways. So let me close out my, my Electron thing here. So this is Hyper. Again, it's a Electron app. I can open up my dev tools. Nothing under this sleeve sort of thing. This is still the normal app. But again, as we saw in the screenshot, let's not turn on my screensaver. Hot corners are fun. All right. So we now have an application name here, Hyper. I can actually go into the About box. You see it's got a custom icon here. Shows what version that we're running, although it's a little bit blurry on that screen. There we go. There's all sorts of other menu items here that we can create a new window, a new tab, split things, look at all kinds of different options here. If I run plugins update, you'll see that we get a notification that reads no changes, because I've done this about 20 times in preparation for this talk. So I don't have any updates, but it's telling me that. And what's more is for something like Mac OS, it actually gives me that as a normal OS notification. You can see all the other places that I've tried to get plugins. And so it's actually built into this. So anytime that your users are expecting to get a notification, it will show up exactly where notifications usually show up. And again, as we saw earlier, we get a custom icons down here. And you can even add commands to these jump lists or shortcuts, such as opening up a new window, that kind of thing. All right. There's one more thing. Let's go into Atom. Here we go. And this one might take a little bit of prep, but let's see if I can do it. So I actually searched for quite a long time to find some way of sharing my touch bar. That didn't work out so well. So we're going to try something a little bit different. And this time sometimes takes a second. There we go. Okay, so that might be a little bit hard to see, but it's the camera on my phone. And if I switch over into Atom here, and then zoom in on this a little bit, with QuickTime up. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. So what it's got is 0 errors, 0 warnings, and 0 info. So what this is, it's an Atom plugin that shows any linting errors that I might have in my application over here on the right, but it shows it right here on my touch bar. And so this is using one of those native APIs that Electron supports to create different things on my touch bar. So if I come in here and let's do something weird, I'll just call a thing called foo. You'll notice that I get an error right here on my touch bar. So it's actually fairly responsive, and it's a normal linting thing. Goes along with the little red squiggly line misspelling thing inside the text editor. But it's a way to access this otherwise unavailable to web browsers thing that's attached to my computer. And this is one of those examples. Others, again, we've got notifications, menu bar access. There are power APIs, so your application can be notified if your computer is about to go on standby, in case you want to, I don't know, stop playing music or something along those lines. So definitely a lot of really great ways to interact with otherwise unavailable APIs inside your computer. Nope. Let me turn off screen mirroring. All right, cool. So one of the questions I inevitably get asked around this point is, this is awesome. I've built these applications. What do I do with them? Well, it turns out Electron actually lets you deploy to app stores. So you can buy a Microsoft App Store submission package, Apple App Store submission package, developer accounts, and get your certificates that you would otherwise use to sign a normal .NET app or a normal Swift app or anything like that, and apply those to your Electron apps and then deploy them to app stores. So right now, the Apple App Store and the Microsoft Store are supported. You can also technically just give somebody an app. And this is actually a great way of distributing apps that, for whatever reason, might not necessarily meet the guidelines of the app stores that you're deploying to. Doesn't necessarily mean anything illegal, but sometimes there are certain actions that you can take with the operating system that app stores don't allow. So especially with Macs, you can call Apple scripts from inside some of your Electron apps. Some of those things pose security risks, and so it's in Apple's best interest, Microsoft's best interest, to not just let these apps go. And so sometimes, especially with dev tools, you can just distribute them manually. And this is actually what Atom does. This is what Hyper does. Slack actually does release their own version, but they also have an App Store edition. And I've never quite been clear on why they've done that approach. Maybe it's just to give even more people access to the applications. But as long as you follow the normal rules of app submission, and it usually takes a little bit of time to really get your head around what is allowed in some of these app stores, but it is worth it. You can absolutely deploy to Apple's and Microsoft's. And then everything else, well, it actually takes a great deal of code to get your applications to the point where you can distribute them, as you might have come to expect. So the bottom command here is Ember Electron's version, but if you're not using Ember Electron, you can use a project called Electron Forge. And Electron Forge is a fantastic open source project for executing or getting your apps to executable states for distribution. It does support code signing, I believe. So if you do want to use, deploy your apps to the app stores, you can still use Electron Forge, but I use it most often to distribute my apps without that. Most of what Electron Forge does is contained in a config file, and we had one of these inside the Ember Electron app that we looked at earlier. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of different things. So one, we have these make targets at the top. So you can specify fairly easily what type of output you want run. So in this case, we're saying build a Debian for Linux distros, and then build a zip file for Darwin, which is Mac OS. There's a long history behind that term I won't get into, but Darwin is Mac OS. And so when you run these commands, it will create those files for you and put them on your operating system. Then you can grab those, upload them to your favorite download site. In some cases, again, submit them to app stores, email them to your friends with subject lines like "this is totally not a virus," whatever you'd like to do with them. Now, one of the other things is this feature, or this syntax actually supports templating, so you can put a product name in here, which means it's a lot easier to make changes in one place and have it sort of distributed among all of your different configurations. So if you need to change your copyright, for example, you can absolutely put all of that stuff in. Now, I'm actually going to back up, because one last thing here on the bottom, this icon. So if you recall, we looked at the resources directory earlier, and that's where a lot of static assets go. This is where you can define what icons you want to be attached to your output files. So define them here. ICNS is a format for Mac OS icons. You can use all kinds of Windows icons, that kind of thing. And when you run these outputs, then whatever is in that particular property there gets copied to your output files. So there's one actually pretty cool thing about not using app stores. And it's not quite the same as some features that you get in the App Store around distribution. It's not going to replace any kind of discoverability, but I still think it's pretty cool. Auto-updating. This is one of the biggest headaches that I've had in my whole history at software. websites are one thing. You just deploy a new version, browsers download it, you're good to go. But if you're actually distributing an application, emailing it to people, letting them download it, that kind of thing, it's really, 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 really difficult to get those things to automatically update. There's some packages that help you with this, but ultimately it's mostly up to the developer to figure this out. Again, the app stores actually do this automatically usually, but I don't know, you still have to submit your apps to the stores. Sometimes it'll take weeks for them to get approved. Even then, maybe they aren't approved. All kinds of really crazy stuff. So Electron has a fairly clever solution to this. If your application runs on Mac OS or Windows, so this is not a Linux feature, unfortunately, yet. If it has a public GitHub repository, if it uses GitHub releases, which if you're not, I encourage you to check those out. There's some pretty cool features inside GitHub for organizing different releases of your product. And if you have configured your build so that they still have code signing, which is a way to make sure that the code that you're delivering actually is what you say it is, then you have some very, very complicated code to write to get auto-updating working in Electron. That. So there's an Electron plugin called Update Electron App. And one little thing I want to draw your attention to here, we're importing this module and then immediately executing it. So there's nothing else to set up by default. This automatically checks for updates every 10 minutes, has built-in UIs for what to display to the user. So it will download your updates in the background, give them a nice little message box that says, hey, there's a new version, click here to update. All of that for you comes from GitHub directly, which is why you need to have a public repo and use GitHub releases. That's how it determines what new versions to show you. And other than that, you've got auto-updating all the time. So I'm actually going to, I don't think I have a new version of Atom. I probably shouldn't have updated recently. But they have exposed a little bit of this feature to users directly for user experience reasons so that you can explicitly check for updates. But it has the ability to simply check for updates. So this is going to say, this is the newest version, everything's good to go. If anyone does use Atom, you may remember a little blue squirrel that appears in the corner. Squirrel is the name of one of Electron's update systems. So it's kind of cute. The squirrel. But if you ever see that, then that means that you've got an app that is working with updates. So, excuse me, there's a few things that I want to kind of leave you with around working with Electron applications. One is it's important to consider the application layout for whatever you're trying to build. So we've talked a couple of times here about different operating systems and different types of layouts that those applications might have. So most notably, Mac OS has a title bar that has the name of your application and some other files and menu bar items. Well, Windows doesn't really have that. And even if a Windows app does have a file menu and an edit menu, usually doesn't have an application menu next to it. So if you're releasing an app from multiple platforms, keep some of these things in mind. Mac OS also has its window controls, so close, maximize, minimize on the left. Windows puts them on the right. So don't put any elements on the right and then expect it to look really good on Windows. One of the other things is the visual style. So Windows and Mac have both developed some fairly unique and distinct visual styles over the last few versions. Try not to fly in the face of those. There are absolutely plugins that you can use, some CSS libraries to help your apps look more Windowsy or more Mac-y, but be careful that you're not using a Windowsy CSS collection for a Mac app or vice versa. One of I don't think there's a lot of hard data on it, but anecdotally, one of the things that people usually come to me and sort of express frustration about is rooted in the fact that apps don't look or behave the way that they have come to expect for that operating system. So keep this in mind. Don't use a Windows style when your application's for a Mac and vice versa. And then the last thing is user experience for that operating system. So Windows has tiles now. They've got progress bars on the start menu. They've got the jump lists. They've got tray icons. Mac OS, on the other hand, doesn't have a lot of those things. It does have menu bar icons. You can still right-click on applications in your dock and get some other commands on them. You've got, as we've said, the application menu. All of these different things are considerations to take into account if you are trying to build cross-platform apps. Now, you don't have to. Nothing in Electron says that you absolutely must release your app for every possible operating system. So feel free to target one to start off with and move from there if you need to. There are actually some decent ideas about this from the mobile industry as well. It's certainly easy to only build an iOS app or only build an Android app. And there are certain approaches for building apps where you can build one of each. But just like in what we've been talking about here, be careful. So make sure that you're not cross-contaminating your user experience paradigms. Does that make sense? All right. So we've got a few minutes left. So I'm going to show one more demo. And I mentioned earlier that there was an application on my dock. Let me actually change my display resolution again. That I created. And this is a little bit of shameless self-promotion. But I'd like to kind of talk about it a little bit and how it was built. So I'm a dungeon master, so I play D&D. If any of you have seen the D&D presentation here, that's like, I was in the back silently geeking the whole time. But I do that a lot. And one of the things that's very important to me is that my players feel immersed. It's kind of like going to a movie theater. The lights dim, you can hear sounds all around you. And that's very important for me for creating a good experience for my players, just as much as user experience is important to me otherwise. So with that in mind, I built an app that lets me create different atmospheric environments for these players. So in other words, I take a lot of sounds and put them together, and then hopefully the players either feel comforted or freaked out or any number of things in between. Now this application is pure Electron. You can see though that I've built in some aspects that mimic what a native app would have. So I have a green title bar at the top that aligns with the traffic lights of window management on the left. I have a normal app menu here. There is the standard edit menu. You can actually get back to this screen through a custom help menu icon that or menu item I've added. And we have the normal icon down here. And then I actually used the code sample that had the file system reading earlier is from this application. So what I have on my laptop is a folder with a bunch of random sounds in it. And then this application reaches into its Electron shell, says, hey, give me the files that are in this folder, and then it gets sent back. And then from that, I generate some lists of things over here for all of the different sounds. So I'm probably not going to do anything crazy here because it's, I don't want to start messing with any audio stuff, but you can turn on, see, can you hear that? Probably not, but you can turn on, there we go, some sounds for these things and combine them together. So I've got some rain here. I'll turn on some thunder that has its own thing, right? So all of this is a combination of reading files from the file system through native NPM modules. And then in this case, the audio is actually being played through HTML5 Web Audio API. So this is a combination of all of those things. It takes strengths from the web, which it's super, super easy. There are tons of plugins for being able to play audio and sounds from a web application. And it also takes advantage of file system access, which is not something that you can usually do in a standard browser app. All right, so if you are interested in learning more, there are a few resources that I would recommend. The main Electron site is at electronjs.org. Amazing API documentation. There's all kinds of details on how to use the different APIs that we've talked about. IPCs, the battery status notification, using NPM modules, compiling your own NPM modules for this, all kinds of stuff. Excellent resource. It also has a list of current Electron apps that people have published. When I checked this morning, there were 540 some odd Electron apps. And this is just the ones that people have actually submitted to the Electron site. There's probably many more on top of that. So this is definitely not a super niche thing. This is a thing that the community has absolutely picked up and have released some pretty amazing apps based off of this technology. Electronforge.io, when I went to this URL, you had to put the www in. I don't know if that's still the case, but I'm a little gun shy now, so I always put that in. Lots of details there on how to get your Electron apps packaged. Ember Electron is the plugin that we used for the Ember side. If you haven't used Ember before, I encourage you to check it out. It's super easy to get started with, especially with Electron. And then these slides are available at the bit.ly link at the bottom, NDC-MN-Electron. So feel free to check those out if you have any other questions or anything. So I appreciate your time. This did not finish the way that it was supposed to, so that's okay. Hopefully you can still read that. If you have any additional questions, I'm going to be up here for the remainder of the time that we've got. I'm on Twitter again, at Tim G. Thomas. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to tweet at me, and I will try to answer those. Otherwise, again, I really appreciate you spending the last session of the very first NDC in Minnesota with me. And again, I'll be up here for a few more minutes. Thank you very much for your time, and everyone have safe travels to wherever it is you came from. So what questions can I answer? Mm-hmm.
There were some hacks out there that you could use.
So the question is, effectively, can you make a borderless window app? Is that, yes. To answer your question, they have absolutely made some improvements there. Let me actually open up the code for the Atmospheres app, and I can show you specifically what that looks like. Don't judge me for all of my uncommitted changes here. Okay, so we already saw, let me make this a little bit bigger. We already saw this new browser window constructor, and you can provide a width and a height. You can also give it a title bar style. And the documentation on electronjs.org has what all of these mean, but hidden inset means that the title bar is missing entirely, and then the rendering surface goes all the way to the top of whatever area is available. So one line gives you a borderless window. So what do you mean by a menu bar? Like the mm-hmm. So the basically Windows version that has like file edit, that kind of thing. I'm mostly a Mac developer. I can't tell you exactly what the property for that would be, but I'm fairly certain that that does exist, a way to just hide that entirely or make it customized to your own needs. I do encourage you to check out the API for that one. Sorry, I don't have an instant answer, but cool. Yeah, we've gotten quite a few changes since from some of the early days. One thing that is related to your question on the Chrome or the title bar is we actually have alpha channels now. So there's a little bit of a rounded corner, and we couldn't do that before either. Everything was sort of very square corners. One feature that's one of my favorites in the newer versions of Mac OS is this sort of frosted glass look. You can do that with Electron, but there's a couple of open bugs right now where it forcibly squares off the corners, which kind of looks a little bit weird, so I have that kind of turned off. But it's the Chromium project is a little bit behind your normal native app development. That's kind of one of the big detriments, is a new API that comes out, for example, the touch bar. You're not instantly going to get access. It's still open source. Someone has to go out and research how to interop with the native APIs, create wrappers for Electron, and then expose those to people. So there's a little bit of a delay there. Touch Bar took a couple of weeks, I think, to get out. The frosted glass look has taken a little bit longer, but eventually Electron does catch up, and one of those early examples was the title bar too. So awesome. Other questions I can answer? All right, cool. Well, thank you very much. Again, if you have any questions that you think of later, don't hesitate to tweet at me. And otherwise, hope to see everyone next year.